Ah, Cuba. So, back to North America, huh? Bien, then today we get to discuss Cuba and its fascinating history. This time in English only, because my mispronunciation of guerra was too much for the Spanish-speaking world to forgive my crimes. Discúlpeme, por favor. So, where do we start with the history of Cuba? Well, we start with the natives. The island was inhabited by a few different groups. The first whose names we know are the Guanahatabe, who would then get driven out of their land by the Taino and Chiboni, which are subgroups of the Arawaks, who migrated and conquered islands around the Caribbean. Initially arriving on the east of the island, the Arawak groups would continue pushing the Guanahatabe westwards as they settled and conquered further west. Then in 1492, good old Columbus would sail the ocean blue and arrive on the neighboring island of Hispaniola. After a bit of troubles and some guerrilla warfare, the natives and the Spanish got along relatively well, with a large amount of male conquistadors and settlers partnering up with the native women, leaving a large percentage of Cubans in the modern day as being mestizos, that is, descendants of both Spanish settlers and Native Americans. Regardless, the Spanish managed to take over the island, along with the rest of the hemisphere. Over the colonial period, Cuba would do a lot of importing, especially of people, those being both Europeans and Africans, usually thanks to Spain wanting to grow extremely profitable sugar, which required Spaniards to manage the farms and Africans and other groups to work the farms. This will become a long-running issue in Cuban history, as ethnic tensions on the island will lead to a large amount of animosity between the different groups. Regardless, the production of sugar started gaining Cuba a lot of wealth, which made it the target of a lot of pirate activities. From, well, pirates, but also privateers. They didn't make a highly successful movie franchise about pirates in the Caribbean for nothing. A couple years later, in 1898, the United States of America woke up and chose violence. Following the explosion of the USS Maine in the harbor of Havana, the US decided that it wanted to remove Spain from the continent, so it declared the Spanish-American War, and after a bit of shenanigans, Spain lost decisively and was kicked out of the Americas. So Cuba instead came under American military occupation for a couple years, until 1902 when they were granted independence. Cuba basically became an American puppet, which led to a ton of financial investment, as America treated Cuba kinda like its summer vacation home, where all the rich Americans would come to hang out and discuss with politicians and other influential people about how best to do drugs and ignore the Great Depression. Anyway, following the Big Sad in World War II, a certain mestizo general with support from a variety of right-wing parties and the United States managed to win the presidency of Cuba. Fulgencio Batista, and his gigantic hat, became the new Cuban president, even managing to secure the communist support in exchange for not banning them from existing as a political party. Batista would go on to become known for his corruption, as a large number of organized crime bosses from America loved to organize mafia activities in tandem with Cuban and American politicians, which gave the idea that the rich Cubans were selling out poorer Cubans to the mafia and foreign interests to enrich themselves. In 1952, Batista launched a coup and suspended the 1940 Constitution, becoming the president for life in Cuba, with the support of many rich Cubans who were interested in keeping their corrupt positions. By this point, most of Cuba's sugar plantations were owned by large American companies, as such basically bribing America into supporting Batista, who promised to protect their economic interests in the island. This all aggravated a certain Cuban lawyer, Fidel Castro. Fidel, his brother Raul, and some other pals of his organized to create the movement, later known as the 26th of July movement, with the goal of militarily overthrowing Batista by taking over military barracks and arming the workers. Which went exactly as you'd expect, as the organized military clapped the revolutionaries and sent them to court. Castro chose to represent their cause himself, yapping for 2 hours during his court case explaining why Batista was corrupt and how he couldn't rule over a bunch of cows, claiming that history would absolve him. Anyway, he was arrested and a bunch of his pals were tortured to death. In 1955, however, Batista would shoot himself in the foot, as he, in a propaganda move, pardoned a lot of Cuban prisoners, including the Castros, who went into exile in Mexico. In Mexico, the pair met up with every socialist's favorite Argentinian, Che Guevara, and prepared to try again, leaving with 82 men on a little boat called the Granma, and planning to militarily overthrow the Cuban government. Okay, not a great plan, but I'm sure they can get lucky. They got lost on the way, crashed onto shore on the wrong part of the island, and got immediately intercepted by the Cuban military. So from 82 men, they were down to 20. Great start. However, the revolutionaries would catch a break, as the American public started disagreeing with Batista's activities, and as such, chose to shoot themselves in the foot and embargo Batista from purchasing military equipment, and instead started giving military aid to different rebel groups, including the 26th of July movement, with the CIA themselves actually training members of the 26th of July movement in guerrilla warfare. Regardless, the revolutionaries, choosing not to be evil to average Cubans they met, immediately made them more popular than the ruling government, which worried Batista, who chose to leave Cuba. All of a sudden, Cuba was without a leader, and this group in the mountains of the south were gaining support. So, now the rebels are the new government, huh? America then expected that, thanks to the support they gave the movement, they would side with America against the Soviets. But unfortunately, America missed the giant red flags that Guevara over there was holding. Realizing their mistake, in 1961, President Kennedy permitted the attempted invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles who were anti-communist. However, he would shoot himself in the foot, as he didn't give the exiles any of the support they needed, leading to them all getting captured by the Cubans. Then in December, Castro would declare socialism in Cuba. Merry Christmas! This meant that Cuba was now solely aligned with the Soviet sphere of the Cold War, with the Soviets bankrolling Cuba by buying their sugar and providing them with oil and other useful things. Initially, Castro declared that there would be democratic elections in Cuba, but those elections kept getting postponed, and eventually Castro dropped his pretexts, and just declared himself to be Prime Minister and later First Secretary of the Cuban state. Castro would also prove to be un poco loco, as in 1962 the Soviets began sending nuclear missiles to Cuba to balance out the American nuclear missiles in Turkey. However, America caught on and began a blockade of the island, attempting to stop the Soviets from being able to eradicate all life on the continent. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a whole topic for another day, but basically, the Soviets and Americans almost ended the world because they couldn't just talk to each other and no one on the ground knew if the war had started yet. And that, combined with the fact that whoever shoots first is more likely to come out not completely dead, meant that everyone's trigger fingers were a little too poised. Any normal person would be screaming at their screen, "For the love of God, don't touch that button!" Meanwhile, our favorite bearded lawyer dictator was instead screaming to the Soviets to nuke America first, saying that Cuba would be martyred, but the rest of the global revolution would live. Thankfully, the Soviets and Americans didn't end the world. However, when Castro heard about this, he threw a fit and trashed his office. Nice. For the next 40 years, the CIA would try every conceivable method to kill Castro, from exploding seashells to exploding cigars to attractive women with exploding sticks. But Castro rolled a 20 for luck and charisma and managed to avoid all of them like a pro. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell, meaning that the financial aid the Soviets were giving Cuba suddenly stopped coming. This began the special era in Cuba, as living standards dropped. And seeing as the Americans still had that blockade going, Cuba was essentially cut off from the rest of the world. That brings us to Cuba today, as the country looks like time stopped in the 50s when imports ended. Cuba is still a socialist state, which comes with its own benefits and drawbacks. Although something you can't deny is that Cuba has a beautiful geography, from its blue beaches to its tall mountains, which makes it a really nice place to go vacationing. Although in modern times, the increase in crime has put a bit of a damper on it, as the last time I visited Cuba was like 7 years ago. Jeez, I'm old. Now Mexico is the preferred tourist destination, but that's neither here nor there.